In 1948, a single man invented one of the most widely used methods for creativity and innovation. And I'm speaking about brainstorming. And the idea of brainstorming can be traced back to a man with the name of Alex Osborn. And Alex Osborn, he lived in the late 1940s, and he was a partner and also a founding member of the advertising and media agency BBDO, which, by the way, still exists today and is a very successful company. And at the time, Alex was really frustrated with the current way of business meetings. He thought that the normal business meeting at the time kind of inhibits creativity. And he was searching for something better. And in 1948, he wrote a book called Your Creative Power. And in that book, on chapter 33, he wrote, "When a group works together, the members should engage in a brainstorm, using the brain to storm a creative problem, with each stormer attacking the same objective." And this kind of became the fundamental idea of the brainstorm, something that got picked up later and was used by the Navy, it was used by the government in the US, then it got used by many, many companies and organizations across the whole world. And it's something that is still today used very often. And I think at this point, everyone in this room in his lifetime has done a brainstorm of some kind in his career. Now here comes the twist. In 1958, so basically just 10 years later, the Yale University took a very close look on how effective actually brainstorming is in achieving the goals that brainstorming wants to achieve. So how effective is it actually at problem solving when you are in a creative environment? And what they did is a very simple experiment. So they had 12 groups of 4 people that were working in the brainstorming method, and then they had 48 individuals that were working as individuals. And after they presented them with a creative problem that they had to solve, they then divided the 48 individuals randomly into 12 groups. So then afterwards they could compare each of the groups against each other. And what they found, very interestingly, is that the group of the individuals were much more successfully, to state the study, they were remarkably more successful in problem solving when it came to having more ideas, having more unique ideas, and also the qualities of ideas was much better. And in the last 10 years, I would say, there were also multiple articles that kind of took a dive into this issue of brainstorming. So from the New Yorker, from the Newsweek, and from the Harvard, some of these are really long-form articles that kind of show different perspectives on the problem. And this kind of raises a question. I mean, brainstorming is a very well-known method, but if the research kind of indicates that it's not really efficient, why is it still used so often? And I have kind of my subjective view or my subjective answer to this, but the answer for the question in my point of view is that brainstorming feels very natural to do. It's something that everybody knows how to do. It's not something that you have to explain. It's very easy to find time for this. You don't need a certain number of participants for a brainstorm. And when you are in a brainstorm, it's also very easy maybe to lay a little bit back, let someone else propose ideas, and you're not really pressured to produce something very good in a brainstorm. But while it's very natural to do and it feels good, maybe the research shows that it's not really efficient. And if you are looking really for goals, then it may be not really the best tool. And the same revelation was made by a guy named Jake Knapp. So Jake Knapp later became the author of the book Sprint, which is here, and also the kind of inventor of the design sprint. But back in the time, in 2008, he was working at Google, and he was doing a lot of brainstorming workshops with people at Google. And in one of those workshops, he got approached by a random engineer, basically, who asked him in the middle of the workshop, "Jake, how do you actually know that brainstorming works?" And at the time, Jake didn't really have an answer for that. So he was kind of struck by this question, and after the workshop, he kind of took a look at the workshop he has done before at Google, and he wanted to spot how much output they have generated for Google. And what he found is that many of the projects and many things that came off the brainstorms didn't really made it into real products or didn't really kind of got executed. And that kind of got him thinking. And 2 years later, actually 4 years later, I think it was in 2012, he started a new position at the company Google Ventures. And Google Ventures is basically the capital arm of Google, in which they invest into startups to help them to be more successful. And at Google Ventures, he had the unique opportunity to work with many, many big startups at the time. And his kind of job was to help them be more successful, or kind of find this gap in the window to go through to actually succeed at the market. And at the time, he was thinking about how can I help the companies in a more effective way and make better things than what we are used now with something like brainstorming. And that's when he kind of started to work on this framework, a kind of new idea how to solve big challenges as a company or as a startup. And he wrote a book in 2016 called Sprint, Solve Big Problems and Test New Ideas in just 5 days. And yeah, the design sprint is very much different to brainstorming, because I would say that it feels kind of uncomfortable. So here's a quote from Jake himself. He says, in a design sprint, you will have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable, uncomfortably fast, uncomfortably be imperfect, and uncomfortably be incomplete. And while it's kind of unnatural and maybe not so comfortable like brainstorming, there are still a lot of things that in a design sprint try to get the best out of people and try to increase the results. And today I want to give you kind of 5 ideas from a design sprint that maybe you can use for group participation and that help to make more efficient group work, basically. So number 1, work on one thing at a time. And for this, I would like to take a look at this calendar. This is basically a calendar that for most of the people that are sitting here, this is basically how your calendar will look. So you have like a week of time, and you can work on one challenge, and you can challenge this like big problem at your company, and you don't have anything that interrupts you in between. And I see people not really convinced that that is your calendar. It's not your calendar. Looks a little bit maybe more like this. So you have kind of separated tasks, very small things that you have to do. You have to fight with Excel, you have to do some meetings, some lunch. And maybe also we have to do some reading and writing of emails, and then we kind of have to split our day. And then maybe there are some people here in the room who are managers, so they have to manage other people's, or there are also people in this room that are not managers, but they still somehow have to manage people because kind of that's their job. And maybe your calendar looks a little bit more like this. And what I like to do in that situation, and maybe there are some people here that like to do the same, to get a little bit sense of control back, is to color code everything. So it looks much better. Now I'm kind of in control back again. And when I look at these colors, like this blue here and this green, it kind of reminds me of a game that I used to play with my little sister when we were younger, called Timon and Pumbaa Jungle Games. And in that game, your task is basically to do a lot of multitasking, and you want to get to the other side and succeed. And this game is really, really fun. It's a funny game. But the serious question that I want to ask you is, let's just imagine you work on a really big problem for your company that requires a lot of thinking. Then do you want the success of solving that big problem to be dependent on your ability to multitask? Because that's what we often do when we have a calendar like this. We have to do a lot of like switching from context to context, and we have to split our time in very, very small things. And in the design sprint, it's much different. In a design sprint, you take a whole week, so basically 5 days, which you kind of work only on one big challenge. And on each day, what you do is you only take up one topic. So on Monday, you do the understanding part. On Tuesday, you sketch. On Wednesday, you do deciding, mostly. In the afternoon, you do a little bit of preparation for the prototype. On Tuesday, you spend a full day prototyping, and on Friday, you do testing. But work on one thing at a time really helps to solve big problems, because the creative problems that we are facing today are getting more and more complex. Number 2, work alone but together. And for this, I would like to take a look back at brainstorming. So how brainstorming basically works is that you grab a bunch of people and everybody works on one challenge together. And then in some kind of not really agreed process, maybe you do some debating, maybe you do some fighting, whatever. You come up with kind of ideas, and then you pick one of these ideas, and maybe you kind of put them into some kind of solution. But it's not really fixed, and there are a couple of problems with it. So first of all, brainstorming kind of provokes that you go for what is obvious, because you are in a group and everything is synchronized, and there's this silence if nobody talks. Then somebody will just propose an idea, and often it's an idea that is very obvious. And that doesn't really help, because you're actually going for low-hanging fruit, so something that is not really helping you in the situation. And the second thing is also that brainstorming encourages to combine and build on ideas, because we humans, we have this cognitive bias of anchoring. So if we are presented with one information, then afterwards, if we think about ideas, then we always reference kind of what we were presented at first. And so we kind of walk all in the same direction. And this is something that you don't want when you want to solve a problem creatively, to walk in one direction. It's not really helpful. And it basically looks a little bit like this then. In a design sprint, it's a little bit different. In a design sprint, you work together in a room, but everybody takes the challenge on its own. So everybody sits there quietly and thinks about, how can I solve this challenge? And it feels weird, it feels super unnatural, because basically you're sitting side by side, but everybody is working on its own. Nobody's like working really together. But what you do in the end is that in the end you get ideas, and those ideas often tend to be much more detailed. And afterwards you do a voting process, and then you come up kind of with the solution. Number 3, don't present your own idea. And this also feels very, very strange. But the reason why I kind of believe highly in this is that often personality outshines content. So often in a work environment, if you have people that are presenting ideas, then it's kind of a sad thing, but sometimes not the best idea wins, but the idea that is presented by the one who is most confident and who can present it in the best communicative way. And this is a real issue, and this kind of gets solved in a design sprint. Because in a design sprint, for example, if you do the sketching on Tuesday and everybody comes up with kind of his own solution, then you don't get the chance by design to kind of present your idea. All you can do is kind of make it self-experimentary by putting some post-its on it, so that when somebody reads it, they can easily understand it. And I think this is really a really great thing, because often in teams, you also have some people that kind of consider themselves as introverts. And because they're introverts, doesn't really mean that they don't have good ideas. And if you do it in that way, it's much more neutral and helps to kind of get ideas from people that normally don't want to present their idea, or normally don't want to go in front of people and kind of put out their idea. And it's a really great way of doing it. Number 4, fake it before you build it. This is something, so in a design sprint, something that you don't do when you do brainstorming, but in a design sprint, what you want to do is you want to build a prototype. And the idea here is that you want to build a prototype that is really realistic, so you can test it with users. But kind of the notion is that today there are so many tools that kind of allow you to fake a degree of realisticness, if you can say it in that way, that basically help you to make a look into the future, how kind of will test users react to it when it comes out, so it's really realistic. And the basic idea is that if you have a prototype, in the back it can look like this, so you can basically put it together with cardboard, or you can do a keynote or a PowerPoint presentation. But what you want in front is that you want users to have a feeling that's really realistic. And the tools for that are there, and it really saves you time, because you don't have to develop something for 6 months and then do some testing and find out it's not working. And we did this in a design sprint with Mr. Specs, basically an online optician here in Germany. And the kind of the prototype that came out, or the concept, was that we had a quiz at the start, and then we kind of used the data from the quiz to present matches of glasses that fit kind of to the data to the user. And the thing is, what we did there is we kind of faked that the algorithm kind of picks glasses and then presents them, because the user actually doesn't really realize that there's no algorithm running that doesn't pick him glasses. And he still has a very realistic idea of how the app should work and how the feature is working. But the work for us at this point is much, much lower than if we have to write a whole algorithm to kind of use the data, present some matches. And that really saves time. Number 5 is one of my favorites. It's called test only with 5 users. Because when it comes to testing, you can ask yourself the question, how many people do I actually need? Do I need to test with 1 person? Do I need to test with 100? Do I need to test with 500? And there's a very interesting study by the Nielsen and Norman group, and they basically took a look at how many people do we actually need to find the most common usability problems in an app. And what they found out is that basically after 5 to 6 people, you already get like 80% of the usability problems. And this is kind of the sweet spot where you want to go, because it's the perfect kind of separation between how much time you put into, because testing with 5 and 6 people is much less effort than testing with 15 people or 30 people, but you still get 80% of the results. And maybe 80% is also a number that is very known for people as the Pareto principle. So basically the whole idea is that in the Pareto principle, is that you invest 20% of your kind of energy and work, and you get 80% of the results. And this is really helpful when it comes to testing, because really quickly you can get the idea of how it should work. To recap. So, number 1, work on one thing at a time. Number 2, work alone but together. Number 3, don't present your own ideas. Number 4, fake it before you build it. And number 5, test only with 5 users. At last, I have some actionables. So maybe if you have a brainstorm next week, don't cancel it. You don't need to. But maybe take one of the directives into your group participation. So for example, try to maybe not work together as a team on one problem and kind of discuss and debate for hours, but try to say, okay, guys, let's sit down, everybody on his own, and we work on this challenge for, let's say, 30 minutes, and let's take a look what comes out of it. And number 2, this is kind of obvious, but learn more about the design sprint. We are kind of biased because we run a design sprint company, but the design sprint is a very interesting principle because it kind of feels unnatural. It's also a lot of fun. It's very intense. But the results that you can get out of a single week where you work on a challenge are really, really high. So it's a very interesting thing to do. That's it. Thank you very much.